searching history for buried classics. This is Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Welcome back to another episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming, our final episode of 2015, and we have another treat for you this week. I am Sean Evans, otherwise known as Zion-Tane.
And I am Sid Bolton, otherwise known as Dirk the Daring online, and I'm also your gaming archaeologist over on the OMG Hour.
So this week we don't have a single game we're going to talk about. We are going to talk with a legendary legend.
Who has worked on and contributed to over 50 games, Sean. 50 games.
Yes, a lot of games. And he was the fifth programmer to join a little-known video game company called Activision. Back in 1982, and we are talking about Steve Cartwright.
Yeah, amazing guy. Steve has worked on so many games that people will probably remember as soon as the names come up, and we'll discuss a bunch of them in this interview. He's also worked for some amazing companies. I mean,
EA.
Activision, of course. He worked for EA, Accolade, just to name a couple, and then even on more modern mobile companies as well. So he's really had quite the history.
Yeah, and you know what? We're going to learn some stuff in this interview about him and about the history of gaming that you may not have realized that he was instrumental in creating, and that's what's fantastic about this interview. So again, it's a little bit different than normal. It's not just a single game. We're actually going to interview Steve and just talk to him about his role in the gaming industry, being one of the founding members of Activision, which is huge, and he really is a legend. Wait for it, dairy person. So without further ado, here is Steve Cartwright. Steve, thank you so much for joining Lost Treasures of Gaming. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So you, of course, are very well known for being one of the, you were the fifth employee, actually, over at Activision back in 1982.
Well, the fifth designer. There were a couple other people in the office. I think I was actually maybe employee number 12 or so, but
okay.
The fifth designer.
Yeah. So basically in on the ground floor of Activision. And was that your first job in the gaming industry?
Well, it's not like any of us had a lot of experience. I mean, that was right at the beginning of the game industry. So,
yeah.
That was my first.
It's like, did you go straight there from college, or what?
No, I had gone to college with a guy named David Crane. Whose name should be familiar.
Just a little old guy that people might have heard of.
After college, we both worked at National Semiconductor, making integrated circuits. Now, this is before home computers, and even before video games. I guess arcade games had just come out, and we worked at National Semiconductor, and Dave was hired into Atari by his tennis partner, a guy named Al Miller. And so a year later, they quit and started Activision, and that's how I got involved.
So was that, before that, was that basically your introduction to creating video games then, or were you kind of dabbling on your own before that?
No, again, that was so early. There was no such thing as really dabbling. I mean, you had to have a PDP-11 mainframe computer in a back room to make these things. So, I mean, was there even, I don't even think there was home computers. So there was no BASIC. There was no nothing.
So when you started in 82 then, what were you building the games on? What were you programming in?
We were programming in assembly language.
Yeah.
And it was a 6502 processor, which probably had, I don't know, a dozen different instructions it understood. And I think to make a game, you only needed to use about 5 of them. And so we had
very special combinations.
Exactly. we had a custom development system that Dave had built because we were originally hardware engineers, and the development system plugged into an Atari 2600. And Bob Whitehead, one of the other original founders, had written the debugger, and we wrote an assembly language. Yeah, I mean, when I started, I didn't even know what assembly language was, so there was about a 10-page little book on it. I took it home over the weekend and memorized it, and then started writing code on Monday.
Wow! And what was the first thing you wrote?
Dave showed me how to write a line of code, a couple lines of code that accessed. It was called an indirect memory access, and so you could read information from the 4K of ROM we had, and store it to hardware registers inside the Atari 2600.
So from there, is that when you started creating? What was your first game you created at Activision?
So my first game was actually Barnstorming.
And is that basically what you started working on almost immediately, or?
Pretty much. I mean, I showed up on day one, and Dave was showing me how to operate the development system and how to edit code. Back then, we used something called a dumb terminal with a character editor, and just printed out lines of assembly language. And if you wanted to edit a line of code, you had to type in go 5 escape equal change 4 escape, to change a 5 to a 4. It was about a 10-step process.
Wow.
Just to edit one byte, one number, or one letter.
One of the things that our other listeners that maybe, especially our younger listeners, may not realize is that you guys at Activision, you were doing things not sanctioned by Atari. It was a much different world back then, where initially Atari was the only company that was creating games for the system. It's not like today where Sony and Microsoft license and Nintendo license out their stuff with their blessings to developers. You guys were doing this on your own without any support from Atari whatsoever. So you were kind of like hitting the hardware directly, and obviously the knowledge that those guys had when they were employed at Atari was brought over, but at the same time, you guys didn't have access to the engineers necessarily that created the stuff, so you're doing a lot of this on your own. This is on top of the fact that you were writing direct assembly code, which in itself is quite a challenge.
Exactly. In fact, when they left Atari, I think the story was that they wanted to start their own company. They didn't really know what they were going to do. So they said, well, until we figure out what we're going to do, let's make some video games. And so the first thing they had to do was reverse engineer the 2600. So they had to take it apart and hook it up to a hardware analyzer and map out all the memory locations, because there was no manual. And so they reverse engineered it from scratch. And so that's how they got it started. In fact, Activision was the first software company, because before that,
third party,
before that, the only companies that made software also made the hardware. So Activision was groundbreaking in that sense as well.
Wow.
And it's interesting that Activision is now pretty much the largest entertainment software company, and Atari is mere sort of subdivision of intellectual property owned by somebody else. So it's kind of interesting how that all worked out.
Well, remember, Activision essentially did go out of business at one point.
Yes,
probably
that is true.
In the mid to late 80s.
That is true.
I don't think I ever knew that.
Oh, yeah. Well, Activision changed its name to Mediagenic and went through a whole... Sean, this is maybe something we can maybe do on another show, even a good old history of Activision, because it certainly isn't the company that like nobody's there now that was there from the beginning. So it's a very different situation. Now I just have one personal question for you along the way here. I noticed that you were also the designer, and I'm assuming programmer, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, on Frostbite. Now, I have a very, very good friend who Frostbite is actually her favorite game still to this day, and remembers that game. So first of all, I want to say thank you from her for working on that game. And although I think we're going to talk about something else you worked on, but I just want to quickly ask you if you remember what sort of the inspiration was for Frostbite.
Frostbite, well, we used to go to Chuck E. Cheese for lunch about 3 times a week. And Frostbite actually came about, and yes, I was the designer and programmer and did the art and designed the box and wrote the manual. I mean, back then everybody, one person did everything.
Yeah.
So I remember I liked a game called Frogger.
Yeah.
And I liked the idea of jumping on things. And so I don't know where the idea of the ice flows came from, but I was jumping on ice flows. Then I thought, well, how do I remember which ones I jumped on? I know, I'll change them. I'll change the color.
Right.
And,
I like Qbert.
Actually, when it actually came out, I think before Qbert.
Oh, really?
A lot of people said, "Oh, you got the idea from Qbert." No, not at all. I'd never seen Qbert. But interesting. Apparently, I was thinking along the same lines as the designer of Qbert.
Well, it's a very, very cool game. We can still talk more about Activision as well, but I think we do different games for Lost Treasures, and of course, you've worked on so many, and you've done so many firsts in the industry, and I want to go back to some of those. But now I want to ask you about specifically about Hacker, just because that's a game that I think is so interesting to look back on in terms of what it was at the time and what it looks like today and how interesting all of that is. And so I just wanted to say to you, like, I obviously, when I was younger, I of course had gone to see War Games, and War Games is still to this day one of my favorite movies. Like, it's in my top 5 movies of all time for sure. And so I remember Hacker being such an amazing thing because essentially when you play this game, you are trying to hack into a computer system, and it gave that real feel of doing that. So I wanted to ask you just a little bit about the inspiration behind it, and I guess essentially the idea. Like, where did you get the idea, and what was it that made you want to make that game?
Sure. So Dave was just finishing up Ghostbusters for the Commodore 64. Yeah. And if you remember the Ghostbusters game, the first thing you do in the game is you outfit your Ghostmobile.
Yes.
You add equipment to it. And part of the game in Ghostbusters is driving through city streets to get to a location.
Yep.
And so I thought that was kind of a cool mechanism. I mean, for me, my inspiration for all games was I would always take something that I knew worked and try to tweak it and reimagine it. So instead of outfitting a vehicle, I said, well, what if you started with a robot and you added pieces to a robot and equipped your robot? And then instead of driving through city streets, I had him driving through underground tunnels. And then I thought, well, instead of going around the city, I'll have him go around the world. These tunnels will operate at such high speed, he can go from country to country, and I'll have a robot that delivers mail. And that was the first idea. And so I built the game up to that point. I had the little robot, and you equipped it, and you flew through these underground tunnels, and you popped up in different locations around the world. Then my wife and I went to see the movie War Games. And I said, oh, breaking into a computer system. That's kind of a cool idea. What if the robot you're controlling wasn't really yours, but it was somebody else's? And you broke into a computer system and took control of this robot. And you were driving around the world. Then, okay, instead of delivering mail, you were meeting with spies around the world, and you were collecting pieces of information. And then that's how the idea emerged. Okay, the information you were collecting was on some secret project, and you had to collect different pieces of the document and piece them together to win the game. So it just, the design actually evolved over about a 3 to 4 month period.
And did you guys have do you remember if there was a lot of people that called in that maybe couldn't get past the login screen or had difficulties quote unquote breaking into the system to get into the main part of the game? Or did people, I mean, obviously you have a help system in there to help people figure out what the password is, but did you have a hard time with getting that just right so that most people could get past it? Or did you have people that were frustrated and couldn't get past the beginning?
I'm sure there were frustrated people. That was, before the days of usability testing and,
right.
and a lot of feedback. I remember when we showed it off to the press, this was probably, was it a CES? This is before E3s. a CES in Chicago, where we invited the press every year to a private suite, and we showed them off the new games. And then so it came time for me to show off my new game, and I announced to the press that, well, we were having some trouble with the game, and what I have to do is I have to use the dial-up modem and call up the computer back in Mountain View, Activision headquarters, and download the latest copy of the game. And so I started up the hacker game. And then I go, wait a minute, what's happening? I got into the wrong computer system. And I basically fooled everybody. They thought it was really happening, that I was hacking into some computer system. And that was the big joke. And so it went over pretty well.
And that's got to be something that they didn't soon forget, and I'm sure wrote quite a bit about.
Exactly.
For sure. And it was ported to so many different platforms. Do you remember what the most successful platform the game was on? Was it the Commodore 64 just because of the installed base, or do you remember?
Boy, probably. I mean, back then, when all the porting was done by it was outsourced, really. So after that released, I was on to the next game. So I had really no time to look back.
Did you develop it on the Commodore 64, or what system was it developed for originally?
Yeah, it was a Commodore 64. And again, we had a custom development system that we plugged into the back of the Commodore. But we were basically writing bits and bytes to the memory locations inside the Commodore, hooked up to a little TV set.
Where is that custom hardware? I want it. I know it's been 30 years or something now, but I'd like that for my museum. That would be perfect. So you work on that, Steve, if you can, after this show. No, I'm just kidding. That would be a great bit of history.
Yeah, I've seen them at various, classic game conventions, but I wish I'd kept some of that stuff.
Now, after, what happened with you in terms of Activision? I know that you went from Activision to another company that I really loved and has a lot of games in it that I really love, which is Accolade. What happened with your departure from Activision? Was that something, did you go along with somebody else that was leaving, or what happened there?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, Activision had gone through, Jim Levy was let go by the board, and somebody else came in and they changed the name to Mediagenic, and they were just doing some horrible stuff. Bob Whitehead and Al Miller had quit to form Accolade. And shortly after that, they gave me a call and said, why don't you come over here? We're having a lot more fun. And that's why I left Activision.
Very interesting. And with Accolade, what did you work on there?
Oh, let's see. The first thing I did, it must have been a game called Fast Break, which was a basketball game. I know that Accolade was focused on sports. Bob Whitehead was doing a football game called Fourth and Inches. They were also doing a baseball game called Hardball. And I decided to do a basketball game, which is actually, it was the first game that used or tried to mimic kind of a TV perspective. Kind of that three-quarter view that you see on TV. Not flat side-to-side scrolling, but a little bit of an angle. And that was really the hook to that game. There was another game at the time by Epix. They had their Summer Games series or California Games, something like that.
Yeah.
It was. They also had Street Sports. They had something called Street Sports Basketball, which was a little 3-on-3 basketball game. And what I did is I bought that and I disassembled the code to figure out how they created those players. It was very clever. and used that technique to create the little 3-on-3 game.
Was the constraints of the hardware sort of something that ended up dictating the design of the game? Were you frustrated that you couldn't maybe have more players? I know, with, Madden football or something like that, which the story has been famously told that, it's got to have a full team of players on it or it's not really a football game. Did you find the constraints of the hardware difficult at the time? And did it really end up changing how the games played?
Well, back then, the Commodore had 8 reusable sprites, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. Which meant you could have 3 players on each team. That was 6 sprites, and that left 2 left over one sprite for the ball and one sprite for the shadow. And so, I mean, I didn't look at it as a constraint. I said, oh, cool, I get to have 3 players instead of 2.
Right.
Back then, the hardware was so limited, we were thankful for everything we had.
Now, you have been credited with all kinds of different firsts in the industry. So if we kind of look a little bit at your bio, there's just so many things. You
created the first video game sequel, I noticed there tonight.
Exactly. We had, this is probably, when was this? Early 80s. I was going through, what did I finish? I think I'd released Sequest and was trying to figure out what to do next and really couldn't think of anything. So about 3 or 4 months went by trying different ideas, and we'd gone to CES again in Chicago, and all the design team went out one night and saw Return of the Jedi. And when
That's
I got
a very,
back to
very
the office,
topical thing right now.
Exactly. When I got back to the offices, I got it. Pitfall 2. And Dave looked at me and said, what? Well, Pitfall 2 will sequel Pitfall, just like Return of the Jedi. And he goes, you can't sequel a video game. and Activision's, again, our job back then, as far as Activision was concerned, was to think of something new. Nobody had ever sequeled a game before. I said, no. And Dave said, look, we've got Pitfall. He runs around in a jungle. What are you going to do, have more jungle? I said, no. Instead of horizontal, we'll make him go vertical down into these lost caverns. And he goes, you're crazy. So I worked up a display, and I had Pitfall Harry running back and forth, and he climbs down a ladder, and he's in this great underground cavern. And Dave looked at it and said, oh, I think you're onto something. And, of course, back then the designers were so closely associated with the game that Dave took it over. So it became Pitfall 2, David Crane's Pitfall 2. Right. But then he ended up actually doing a lot more with it. He came up with some custom hardware to greatly expand the capability and add music. But, I conceived
the music in that game was really amazing, for sure.
Yeah, it was from a custom and chippy design. But, that was the first video game sequel.
I'm sure many people thank you for opening up the doors to video game sequels.
And like movies, there are some good ones and there are some bad ones.
Exactly.
So we talked about Hacker earlier, and that's considered to be the first story-driven graphic action-adventure game. So that must be that. And again, that type of thing is the basis for a lot of the games today, but also of course, the sports games. You worked on so many different sports games, and you also worked with Scott Orr, if I'm correct, who did. He was, for those that don't know, he did a lot of the early sports games on the Commodore 64, and then of course moved on to other companies as well. And you've done so many things. Do you ever look at the video game industry today and realize what an influence you've had on things that are out there today, or is that stuff in the past and you don't think about it, or do you think about it quite a bit?
Recently I gave a presentation to a design school in Cleveland, the Cleveland Institute of Art, and I had to put together a slideshow. And one of the slides I put together, and most of the stuff I had done was before these guys were even born. But what surprised me is they'd done their homework, and they were asking me, remember that routine you wrote for this game? How did you manage? I go, oh my gosh, I don't even remember that. But one of the slides I did was on Tiger Woods golf. And I explained to them that when I went to EA, I took over the golf team, and EA's golf product at the time was so bad that they were going to kill it. I mean, EA was known for Madden football and NBA basketball and NHL hockey, but the golf franchise at EA was just the worst on the market. And they were contractually obligated to do one more game for the PGA Tour, so they assigned it to me. Said, Cartwright, just finish this thing, get it out the door, and we're going to cancel the franchise and lay off the team. And I didn't know anything about golf. I'd never played golf in my life. So I went over to the store and I bought a book called Jack Nicklaus Teaches Golf. This is way before Tiger Woods. And inside the book was done in cartoon form, and they showed a large arc around the player, a cartoon drawing of an arc around the player to get you to visualize the swing plane, and they showed a big bullseye on the green to get you to visualize a target, and they drew a big arc through the sky to visualize the flight of the ball. I said, oh, that's cool. Well, let me put these things in the game. And so I created a very graphical user interface with a big curve around the player and an arc through the sky. My goal was to create a game that was fun to play, that happened to be golf. But, with the other golf games on the market at the time, they were hardcore simulations, and it was hard to break 100. I said, no, I want to make you feel like you're on the PGA Tour and playing with these pros. So I want to make a game where you can shoot par the first time you play it.
Yeah.
And I finished the game, and back then, each franchise was its own little entity. In other words, EA was the publisher, but nobody from EA actually told me what to do. They just said, oh, make a golf game and let us know when it's done. So I finished the game, and EA looked at it and said, well, this is a joke. This is silly. This is cartoonish. I said, look, you're going to cancel the franchise anyway. Just, it's too late now. You got to ship it. So they shipped it, and they quadrupled sales forecasts.
Wow.
Because it was fun and easy to play. And they said, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't cancel the franchise.
and look where it went. I mean...
Yeah. And so what I did for this presentation, I put up two slides, a slide with two images side by side. One was my original PGA Tour interface with the big C-shaped curve around the player and the arc through the sky. And next to it was a picture of Tiger Woods 2015 with a big C curve around the player and the arc through the sky. And they were identical. And so the interface I came up with 20 years ago is still in use today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not big into sports games, but the Tiger Woods PGA Tour games I have loved for many, many years. I am a golfer. I like playing golf in real life, so I love playing golf on my console as well. So thank you for creating PGA Tour.
And that's from a guy who'd never played golf in his life.
That's amazing, and that franchise is still going. I mean, now it's Rory McIlroy, but that franchise itself, PGA Tour, is still going strong.
That's true.
Now, you took a break for about 10 years before you joined Glue Mobile to make games as a programmer again. And so then you got back into programming, and it seems like you worked on so many different things. And, of course, I'm sure the hardware is completely different, and the development cycle and the way things worked completely different, because you have an interesting perspective on the industry, because you've worked as a programmer and designer when you were the only person doing everything, to now where games are, of course, usually much more team driven and so on. So what about now? Do you still work on games, or what's happening with you today?
Well, I spent the last 3 years working for an enterprise company, of all things, but as it turned out, they needed help making an enterprise product fun and easy to use. Oh. And so I was using the exact same techniques I used when designing games to make their interface. But I'm actually, still on the side doing some games, working on, of all things, a casual casino game. Got a patented idea that we hope to be releasing in the next couple months. Casino games didn't really interest me, and again, I'd never played a casual casino game. But somebody approached me with this patented idea, and I said, yeah, I can make this fun to play. And so, I'm still involved.
Very cool.
And if you look back at all the games that you've worked on, from, Mega Mania to Barnstorming, Frostbite, Hacker, any of those, up to the sports games that you worked on later on in your career, if there's any game that you could, basically remake or reimagine or redo today, is there any one that you've always wanted to take another stab at, maybe don't have the rights to or anything, but is there any one of those children of yours that you'd like to bring back to the limelight today if you could?
I'll tell you what, after Hacker, I did a game called Hacker 2, which I guess was maybe the second video game sequel ever done. And in Hacker 2, again, you were controlling a robot, but you were controlling it through an office building late at night, and you had to avoid security cameras and roaming guards. And it was actually the first example of stealth gameplay. And, it was a pretty successful game. I think I even got the, Programmer of the Year award for that game.
Nice.
And after that, I started on Hacker 3. I said, I think we're really onto something with this stealth gameplay, having to sneak around, avoiding cameras and guards. And, Activision management said, oh, no, 2 is enough. Let's move on to something new. Of course, a year later, a game called Metal Gear comes out from Japan, which was stealth gameplay. And of course, that's gone on to, become the basis of, every major, probably military franchise and spy franchise. So I wish I'd kept up and pushed the envelope a little further on the stealth gameplay aspect.
It's funny that your statement there was that Activision said no, 2 is enough.
Right.
And yet, look at what Activision puts out now, year after year.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's right. They're the king of the sequels now. I mean, same with EA, right? I mean, both EA and Activision are notorious for churning out sequel after sequel after sequel, and it's interesting that you were the person that really came up with that initially, and you've actually worked for both companies at one point in time or another, so that's kind of interesting. Now, do you still have any of your design notes from Hacker 3? Like, maybe we can help you get this sucker made. I mean, do you have anything like that? Did anything of that survive in your own personal archive, or is that stuff that you've long since left behind?
God, I don't even remember what the concept was. I mean, we're talking 30 years ago. So, I wish.
That's only 30 years.
Only
30 years. I remember playing those games, but I certainly couldn't remember much else from that time period. Although, when I think back, like Hacker, I absolutely loved, and part of that was because of my love for war games, and I did see the similarities there as well. And of course, although I didn't have a 2600 when I was a kid, I played them, but later on, when I got into collecting video games, of course, many of the Activision titles, including all the ones that you worked on, are among my favorites. So thank you for all of those and for all the work you did. And what an amazing career you've had in terms of what you've contributed to the industry. It's a lot of times we don't realize or we forget about how games, just like computer software and computers in general, are always built on the previous things that made them better, or the thoughts that they had, and the best things tend to make reappearances later on and are built from those previous things. And there's so many things that you did that are still so visible today. So it's just amazing all the different things that you've done that have survived to modern gaming. So thank you for all the contributions that you've given the industry. You've certainly done a lot of them.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's great to talk to people who actually know their history and know where some of this came from. It's funny, once in a while now when I if I work in a company, most of the kids, again, probably weren't born when I did my first game. And geez, half of them don't even know what a cassette tape is. So it's, it's great to talk to somebody who knows and understands and appreciates, where this stuff came from initially.
Yeah. Well, and we just, sorry, Sean, we were just going to say, we just, of course, this type of stuff we keep alive at the Computer Museum. And just tonight, actually, somebody dropped off a Commodore 64 and a disk drive in perfect condition. Honestly, looked like it had just came out of the store. It looks mint. There's nothing wrong with it. And we actually have Megamania most recently set up on the Atari 8-bit computer system, which would have been a port from the original that you did. But people have, just as of last month, were playing that game and having a great time playing it out in the museum. So it may be the first time that they're discovering stuff like that, but that's why we like doing this, is like we love showing people how fun the gameplay was in those games. And even if the graphics weren't the best. Certainly for the time period, they were good, but for, compared to today's game, they're maybe not. But the gameplay is really what matters at the end of the day, and people still have fun, and people still laugh and love to play your game, so I thought you should know that.
Well, it's interesting. We used to spend, of course, making those displays was actually very complicated because of the assembly language involved. Right. But whereas today, they'll work 9 months on a game and spend the last 2 weeks tuning it. Back then it was more like, okay, work 2 weeks on the game and spend the rest of the 9 months tuning it.
Right.
And so it was endless adjustments. Okay, well, let's try the next level. No, that's a little too hard. Let's ratchet it back. No, that's a little too easy. Let's go forward a little bit. No, that movement's a little too slow. Let's speed it up. I mean, it was endless. I mean, we would spend weeks and weeks and months tweaking that stuff. And so if it's still fun today, that's why. There was a lot of work that went into that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Thank you again, Steve, for coming on the show. Like, you have had a tremendous effect on the world of video games, our beloved world here, and I do appreciate everything you've introduced. Like, the first sequel of video game. No one even thought of doing sequels until you thought of doing Pitfall 2, and that's awesome. I mean, look at the gaming world now. It's endless sequels. So you've definitely had a huge impact on our world, and I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure. Anytime. I'm happy to talk to you guys.
So how can our listeners find out more about you? Are you on Twitter? Do you have a website they can visit?
I have a website. It's, stevecartwright.com. And there's, I think I've done over 50 games. So they can browse some images from some of the games. They're not all up there, but a lot of them are up there. So they can, take a trip through memory lane. In fact, I don't even know if all my old 2600 stuff is on there anymore. I'll have to refresh and put it up again.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Steve, for being on the show. We really appreciate you taking some time.
Great, my pleasure.
Sid, as a fan of things like Assassin's Creed, I have to thank him for creating the video game sequel. That was
and many other things. Yeah, like he's amazing.
Like that statement he said, but where Activision said, no, 2 is enough. You think back to the mentality of gaming back then to the mentality of gaming today, and it's a totally different world. For them to think, no, 2 games in a series is enough, and then you look at things like Call of Duty where, is there even an end? Right. And it's amazing what he actually introduced to the gaming industry that is just standard protocol today.
Absolutely. And, one of the things I love about these interviews is that there's always these nuggets of information that we get out of these guys that, it just isn't on a Wikipedia page or just isn't anywhere else. There's so many little tidbits that only come out in conversations like this, which is one of the reasons why I just absolutely love this show. And as well, it just, I don't know, to talk to someone who's seen so much in the industry, honestly, I could have talked to him all night, about different things. So, I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk to him for the time that we did. But so many interesting tidbits. And this is a guy that literally has seen everything in the gaming industry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What a pleasure to speak to someone like Steve. And, that's the opportunity we have with this show, and we are so fortunate to be able to speak to these people. This being our final episode of the year, let's just have a quick look back. Last week was Mark Cerny. Hello. Right? Mark Cerny, we've had American McGee, it's just, and Bill Hogue, this has been an awesome year for Lost Treasures, for this little show that we do every week, try to do every week, as a spin-off of the OMG Hour. It's just, I don't think we realized how fortunate we were going to be with all of these people that we've been able to interview.
Yeah, and it's not just the heavy hitters like, the Mark Cernys and the Steve Cartwright, but we've talked to some really interesting people like Mark Vitek, for example.
Yeah, exactly.
Who just, has started out with, making a game that was contributed to a magazine, and then he's managed to keep in the gaming industry his whole life. And then we went a little bit away from, specifically from game designers, and talked to Jerry Buckner, of course, behind the Pac-Man Fever album, and, Paul Norman, who was with Cosme for so long and made Forbidden Forest. And I know we got to talk to Ron Rosen, for example, about Mr. Robot and his Robot Factory. And that one was completely for you, Sean.
Of course it was.
And,
my favorite Commodore 64 game.
Yeah, and Mike Micah, of course, also known as the Donkey Kong dad. That was great to talk to him. And, of course, we talked about, Rescue on Fractalus with Dave Fox and Ken Rogaway, Ghostbusters. I mean, we've talked to so many different people. I can't forget, of course, the David Clark from the Sopwith guy. And just, again, always things that I think we had a good mixture this year of games that you heard of and games you never heard of, and people that you've heard of and people that you have heard of. So I think we had a good mix, and that at the end of the day, that was really what, for me personally, was trying to accomplish. So I think we did that in spades, and it's been a great journey for our first year with this show, and I look forward to next year.
So I want to wish everybody a very happy new year. I hope you had a wonderful Christmas or holidays, whatever it is you celebrate. But I do wish you a very happy new year on behalf of both Sid and I and everyone involved in OMGNexus.com. Of course, the OMG Hour, Prime Time, Gamers Unscripted. I would like to say, Sid, personally, thank you, because you are the backbone of this show. Honestly, you are the one who arranges all these interviews. I have done nothing except show up and talk. And then I put the show together and release it. But thank you for doing all the legwork on this show. I do appreciate it. It's fantastic.
Not a problem. It's quite a treasure hunt in itself, trying to track down some of these developers and get a hold of them, and then, of course, get them to agree to come on the show. And I haven't always been successful, but I think we've had some amazing guests, and thank you to all the guests that have been here in our first year, and we look forward to the second year. And I know, as more and more people discover this show, they'll get to listen to some of the great interviews we've already had. So I'll keep bringing them to you, and hopefully you'll keep listening.
Excellent. Quick shout-out, thank you to Fred Rojas, of course, over at GamingHistory101.com, who has been so gracious to do videos every week based on the game that we feature here on Lost Treasures. So, Fred, I know you're listening. Thank you for all the work you put into that. Dear listeners,
Fred, my Christmas gift to you this this episode is you can pick any of Steve's games.
Any one of them.
That's doesn't matter which one.
Or do them all 50 of them.
Hacker would be good.
You
choose.
Yeah.
You choose.
So, of course, listeners, thank you for listening to our first year of Lost Treasures Gaming. We hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to visit GamingHistory101.com every Friday for Fred's new video. You can follow us on Twitter at LostTreasuresOG, and I am Zion everywhere.
If you're looking for me, I'm at Sid Bolton on Twitter. That's Sid with a Y. And if you do have any questions, or if you have any ideas for a future episode, maybe somebody you think we should cover, or a game we should cover in the Lost Treasures segment, please send us an email to losttreasuresofgaming@gmail.com. And if you want to read our show notes and maybe get links to some of the fascinating stuff that you heard on this episode, or say, for example, a link to Steve Cartwright's website, you can find all of that and more, including game reviews and links to our other podcasts, at omgnexus.com.
So that's it. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This has been Lost Treasures of Gaming. We'll speak to you again in the new year.
See you soon.
This has been an OMGNexus.com production.